Welcome, student, to this deep explainer of Leviticus chapter 27. Now, at first glance, a chapter filled with property valuations, percentages, and sanctuary shekels might just seem like a perfectly dry appendix. It's exactly the kind of chapter modern readers routinely skip right over to get to the more exciting or seemingly spiritual narratives. But do not miss this. This text is actually a deliberate, magnificent epilogue to the holiness code. It's placed right here at the very end of the book to ensure that our devotion to the Lord doesn't just stay neatly packaged at the bronze altar. Because true holiness, well, it has to touch the everyday realm of our promises, our property, and our physical assets.
To guide our study today, here is the expository lecture matrix we're going to follow. We will look at the historical and cultural background, the biblical narrative regarding valuation rules, and the narrative surrounding land and the Jubilee. Then we will dive into the theological significance and systematic doctrines, followed by spiritual lessons and application, before finishing up with a conclusion and a pastoral blessing.
Let us examine the historical and cultural background. In the agrarian society of ancient Israel, making a vow was a purely voluntary act of devotion. It was a beautiful way for individuals to recognize God's help, often in moments of deep distress or profound gratitude, by pledging a tangible gift in return. Leviticus 27 steps in to provide a vital framework, ensuring that this passionate devotion actually strengthens community life rather than creating economic confusion or inequity.
Now, to truly grasp the weight of this text, we absolutely must ground our study in a literal, grammatical, historical reality. You see, we have to place this chapter precisely within God's unfolding program. We are operating here under the fifth dispensation, the dispensation of law. God is actively establishing a precise theocratic framework for national Israel. The rules laid out right here are specific to this covenantal context. We are managing the economy of holiness for a newly formed nation that is literally dwelling in God's manifest presence. The Creator of the universe has pitched his tent right in their geographical center, and that magnificent, undeniable reality changes how every single goat, field, and vow is handled.
To maintain absolute fairness in this economy of holiness, God instituted a standard. Valuations for vows were anchored by the sanctuary shekel. That's a standardized weight of 20 gerahs. Now, consider a fascinating historical reality for a moment. In the ancient Near East, merchants frequently used shifting, dishonest scales to cheat the vulnerable, right? They'd use a heavy weight when buying from you and a light weight when selling to you. God's sanctuary shekel was a revolutionary demand for absolute economic integrity. It completely protected the worship economy from shifting scales and local favoritism. But I want you to notice the incredible warmth of God's character here. There was a pastoral allowance built directly into the law. If a person was simply too poor to pay the standard rate for their vow, the priest would actually assess a fitting amount based on what they could genuinely afford. So God preserves both absolute, unyielding holiness and incredibly tender compassion.
Let us examine the biblical narrative valuation rules. As we move verse by verse into the text itself, we are going to see clear regulations for dedicating persons and animals to the Lord. The text traces the journey of a vow from the initial promise all the way to its fulfillment.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the mechanics behind these vows. First, a worshiper volunteers a vow. Second, the priest assesses its value. Now, if the worshiper pledges, say, an unclean animal, one that cannot be offered on the altar, they do have the option to redeem it or buy it back. But doing so requires paying the assessed valuation plus an additional 1/5. So why a 20% premium? Well, human beings are notoriously fickle, aren't we? We tend to make passionate, sweeping vows in the middle of a crisis, in the foxhole, so to speak, but we suddenly experience a sharp bout of buyer's remorse when the crisis fades and the sun comes out. That added fifth is God's strict, tangible deterrent. It completely prevents rash vows and ensures that promises made to the Almighty are never, ever treated casually. Taking back what you promised carries a very real, very heavy cost.
Let us examine the biblical narrative, land, and Jubilee. Moving into verses 14 through 25, our focus widens to real property, specifically the regulations governing the dedication of houses and, most importantly, fields, which were the very anchor of Israelite families.
This brings us to a really beautiful concept, Jubilee logic. Every 50th year in Israel was the Jubilee. It was a divine reset that returned hereditary fields right back to their original clans. Because of this, if a man vowed his field to the Lord, the priest tied its valuation directly to its seed capacity and the strict countdown of years remaining until the next Jubilee. Think about the profound beauty of this grace for a second. God engineered a system where religious devotion could never be weaponized to bankrupt a family. The land is ultimately the Lord's, and Israel are merely his tenants. This careful, brilliant mesh of worship and property prevented religious piety from becoming a backdoor for land consolidation. It protected generations of families from permanent loss. Absolutely brilliant.
Let us examine the theological significance, systematic doctrines. Beyond the practical agrarian rules, verses 26 through 29 reveal the unalterable claims of God, providing a rich, solid foundation for our systematic theology. Let's explicitly categorize these doctrinal truths, slowing down just a bit to really appreciate their depth. First, hamartiology, the study of sin. The concept of devoted things, which we'll look at in just a moment, vividly reveals the terrifying gravity of sin and the absolute finality of God's holy judgment. Next, soteriology, the doctrine of salvation. That added fifth required to redeem a vow reminds us that redemption is incredibly costly. This Old Testament shadow points like a direct arrow to the cross of Calvary. It anticipates the New Testament truth that we were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. And finally, Christology. The law states the firstborn animal cannot be vowed because it already inherently belongs to God. This prior claim points squarely forward to Christ, the supreme firstborn over all creation, whose resurrection secures an entirely new family for God.
And we must carefully contrast regular vowed items with what are called devoted things. Regular vows were voluntary and, as we saw, could be redeemed. But things devoted to the Lord, placed strictly under the ban, were most holy. They were absolutely irrevocable. They could not be sold or redeemed under any circumstances. We actually see the severe dramatic historical fulfillment of this during the conquest in Joshua chapter 7. Remember Achan? He stole devoted things from Jericho, brazenly crossing God's absolute boundary regarding the most holy things. This act of spiritual treason brought catastrophic, terrifying defeat upon the entire nation of Israel until the sin was judged and purged from the camp. It is a sober, undeniable reminder that under the theocratic administration, God's holiness demands absolute, unyielding compliance.
Let us examine the spiritual lessons and application. As we shift our focus to the ecclesiological principles, how this all applies to the gathered church today, we need to extract the timeless principles of stewardship and devotion. And this brilliantly illustrates a vital theological boundary. We must consistently maintain the strict theological distinction between God's program for national Israel and his program for the church. Under the law, national Israel was mandated to give a strict 10% tithe of their agrarian yield and flocks. This was essentially a theocratic tax to fund the nation and the priesthood. Today, under grace, the church is not bound by the theocratic tax of the Levitical tithe. Instead, as outlined in passages like 2 Corinthians 9, the apostles instruct the church in open-handed, proportionate generosity. It is to be driven by a grace-based, cheerful heart, not some rigid legal mandate. You see, the external form of the giving differs drastically across the dispensations, but the internal direction is exactly the same. Recognizing God's holy claim awakens glad, joyful devotion.
So, what should you take away from this? Well, Leviticus 27 summons believers today to profound integrity. Let your yes be yes. It teaches us true stewardship, reminding us that our earthly assets, every single dollar, every single hour, are trusts from God, not our absolute possessions. It fundamentally reorients how we value people. We do not judge worth by economic earning capacity, as seen in those ancient valuation charts, but by the immeasurable price paid for their redemption in Jesus Christ. Furthermore, that solemn concept of the irrevocable devoted thing deeply informs our spiritual warfare today. We are called by the Apostle Paul to completely put to death our earthly nature, idolatry, impurity, greed. As a pastor, let me urge you, treat these sins as things under the ban. They cannot be bargained with. They cannot be reclaimed or managed. They must be utterly devoted to destruction.
Let us examine the conclusion and pastoral blessing. We have reached the very end of this profound book, synthesizing the tremendous weight of this epilogue.
The book closes with these enduring, monumental words in verses 30 through 32. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. Every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod will be holy to the Lord. NIV. The grand, unmistakable summation of the book of Leviticus is that true holiness absolutely refuses to remain solely at the altar.
It must march right out of the sanctuary. It must permeate our homes, our deepest promises, our bank accounts, and our fields. Devotion to God is measurable, it is merciful, and it is overwhelmingly true.
Student, before we part today, I want you to ask yourself a deeply provocative question. Does your devotion to God stop safely at the church doors, or has His consuming holiness laid absolute claim to your bank account, your calendar, and your deepest promises? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May you walk in the absolute freedom of knowing that you belong entirely to the Lord, purchased by the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Let His holiness mark both your worship and your daily work. For more in-depth studies, visit the Grace and Knowledge series blog at woodybrom.online.